we actually have an sort of honorary third participant. Marwan, because of the travel ban, cannot be here this evening, but he did make a recording for us, greeting everyone and reading a little bit from the book. This came in at like 10:30 into my inbox this morning. The Strand has it now, and we're really excited to share that with you. Thank you all.
Hi everyone, this is Marwan. It's unfortunate that I can't be here in person due to restrictions on travel, but I wanted to thank PEN America, the Strand Bookstore, Alexis Okeowo, Mali Crabapple, and all of you for being here. I also wanted to read you a few lines from Brothers of the Gun. They're about life under ISIS in Raqqa back in 2014. Gradually, ISIS gathered all public life into its dominion, and the jihadist mentality penetrated people's minds. How we argued about the occupiers. Their ideology was not merely a set of thoughts that clashed against conflicting opinions, but a way of life, complete and alien, that would accept no coexistence. In its elevation of ignorance, its ecstatic embrace of cruelty, it would destroy every standard and value outside itself, and so give its adherents the authority to negate, or at least ignore, the rights of others, including the right of privacy. It gave each of us two choices: subservience, if in appearance only, was one way to go. On the other path lay humiliation, torture, and death. So confronted, I chose the strategy of simply living day to day. Look no further than 24 hours ahead, for in terms of consequences, a day in the land of jihad equaled, perhaps, months of a normal life. You could die and be reborn in one day. You could become penniless or crippled in the blink of an eye.
So I actually marked that passage because I thought it was just beautifully written, and it kind of illustrated the sort of everyday act of resistance of living under ISIS, living in a war zone, and just trying to get on with the business of living. And that's something that's, continually illustrated in this memoir. And I wonder if you could talk about that, talk about the importance of showing that even in this difficult situation, people are just trying to live.
Thank you so much for the kind words. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, perhaps, that people who have never been through a war have in their head is that the war starts and everything else stops, right? That there's like a straight break and you go from, a normal life where everything is fine to a war life where all you think about is war. Whereas in actuality, I think so much of the experience of war is trying to hold on to those parts of the old life. I remember I was reading memoirs of Marek Edelman, who was a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he talked about how even in the Warsaw Ghetto, even as it got worse and worse, people, they made cafes and they had nightclubs and they tried to spend their money having joy, even in the literal Warsaw Ghetto while people were being deported to Treblinka. I think one of the most human capacities is the capacity to try to strive for normality. And there is passages in your book that you wrote so beautifully about that too. Alexis's book, by the way, is a work of just solid genius. It follows 4 different characters in Uganda, Somalia, Nigeria, and Mauritania, and it's amazing. So I wanted to, if it's okay, I wanted to actually just read you from your own book this beautiful line that you had that reminded me of something very, very similar. So this is Alexis. She was writing about a restaurant that was frequently bombed by Al-Shabaab, which is a terrorist group. And you wrote, the evening I was there, this is after bombing, I felt no traces of death. The owner had repaired and reopened the restaurant within weeks. and people had come back as if nothing had ever happened. That was how things went in Mogadishu. While they lasted on this earth, Somalis would not be denied the few pleasures it had to offer them. Do you want to talk about that, about writing about the pleasure and joy in the midst of these incredibly difficult circumstances?
Yeah, well, what I found so extraordinary about this book is just having this inside close look to like the joys and the frustrations of life in an extreme situation. And I, had a sort of a secondary view of that as being a journalist and going to a place like Mogadishu where I'd never been, and because of stereotypes and news headlines, I assumed it would be this really difficult place, constant terror attacks, constant gun battles in the streets, everyone hiding inside, women being wrapped up. And then I get there, and the second day I'm there, I'm at this beautiful beach restaurant. Families are going out on boats in the ocean, people are taking selfies and like having ice cream in the restaurant, and I realize this is nothing like I expected. And of course, why would it be like how I expected? And that all of these places have this complexity and nuances that even in a war zone, even in a place where things have fallen apart, people still have to do the things that we do on a daily basis. You just have to go to work and go to school and take care of their family and go to weddings and funerals and all of that daily dramas. And so it was nice to see that, and I write about how I didn't expect that, but how I should have. And in your book, I like how you guys talk about the fact of not only needing to get on with the daily business of living, but that even when Raqqa becomes overtaken by ISIS, and from the outside, observers would say that it's a matter of either fleeing for your life, or if you stay, you become compromised, that there's actually an in-between that Marwan inhabits. And I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Well, many people stayed in Raqqa under ISIS because they didn't want to live in a refugee camp, right? They didn't want to live in a place with, I went with my friend Pat Hillsman over here. We went to the Baba Salem IDP camp just inside Syria, and it's a place of impossible grimness with, sewage, sewage on the sort of dirt roads, and one meal a day served by the Turkish government, and people freezing to death in the winter, and people don't necessarily want to leave their homes to end up in such a lovely situation. And also in Syria, a lot of times people's entire wealth, right, was in real estate. Everything that you had was tied up in building. So people, they wanted to hold on to what they had. And also, as the war went on, there started to be this idea when people looked at how the rest of the world was treating Syrians, how they looked at the racism in Lebanon, for instance, or the way that they were being confined to camps in Jordan, or the pogroms that were even happening in Turkey, or also the horrific camps in Greece, and just the ways Syrians were discussed. People started being like, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go. I'd rather die in my home than be humiliated by being the world's problem. And I know this is something that Marwan talks a lot about, the humiliation of being a refugee. So people, they stayed. And another thing that he talks a lot about is he's spoken to me a lot about, and we wrote about in the book, the idea that conquerors or liberators, they come and they go, but they're the people of the land. And if Syrians leave, then the land goes to someone else.
And what was refreshing about this book is that there were no Western characters. There were no white saviors, no Western saviors. It was completely from the from Marwan's perspective. All the people in the book are people in his life, people he met in Syria, in Turkey. Was that something important to you?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, I loathe these books that are about the stories of an American going and saving other poor countries. They're stupid, they're trivial, they're frankly embarrassing. I know it's something that you must have to deal with a lot in covering Africa. And we didn't want to do that, and also we couldn't, because that wasn't Marwan's story. Marwan lived in Syria. with a few breaks to go to Turkey up until early 2016. And in fact, when we were writing it, because I am in the book, I was like, Marwan, I think you should just call me like the artist, because it's just I didn't want it to be like, oh, I did this great thing, And I was always joking with him that if we wanted to make a really big Hollywood movie deal with the book, that we would have to replace him with a blonde American exchange student who teaches Ruckins about democracy. And you have a beautiful quote too, which I wrote down. You said, "For me, it's about centering the voices and not having any kind of Western saviors, including myself as a journalist." Can you talk too about like the role and the embarrassing and malignant role of Western saviors in your field?
Yeah, because I think there, in the coverage of Africa, there's a long tradition of feeling like there needs to be, I think as Nick Kristof put it, a Western bridge character in order to get readers to care about subjects. You have to have like sort of the white NGO worker
because
saving.
How else?
Yeah, why else would you care about people?
It's not like they're human, otherwise.
Right. And that's kind of what you're taught when you enter covering places abroad, covering the global South. But it's something that I think a lot of people hopefully realize fairly quickly, that you don't have to have characters in your stories who are being the heroes or intervening and saving your subjects, because often in real life that's not the case. In fact, we were talking about in countries that we've written about, Western powers have often intervened and and created more problems than there were in the first place, and people don't like to talk about that. And so I think what I tried to do is just find people with interesting stories and tell those stories in their words, and usually those stories are interesting enough for people to want to read them, as opposed to having someone who maybe looks like them. Instead, find the qualities of these subjects that are maybe more like us, talk about their backgrounds, talk about their interests, and let readers connect on that front, as opposed to, having our random Joe, saving the day.
By the way, have you guys seen Radiate, the parody skit? It's, I think, Nigerian actors talking about sending radiators to Norway because it's so cold, and the poor Norwegians, they might freeze to death. It's like the best comedy skit about Western saviors. One of the things we both were really concerned with in the book is we were concerned with creating nuanced characters, particularly when the people we were writing about were ones that either wouldn't be sympathetic to the West, or frankly just were not sympathetic people because they were part of terrible, terrible groups and had done terrible, terrible things. One of the chapters that people have really responded to in Brothers of the Gun it's called Abu Mujahid's Prosthetic Dick, and it's a portrait of a teenage ISIS fighter. Now this kid, his father was an insurgent against the Americans. His father's a member of Al-Qaeda. And he had raised this kid since the day he was born to hate the infidel and to want to make bloody holy war and create an Islamic empire. And that was what the kid's head was stuffed with. But he was also a teenage boy. And I don't mean teenage boy as like a heroic thing. I mean, he was a teenage boy with all the superficiality and desire to play video games and lack of desire to do difficult things and desire to steal cigarettes and look at porn that implies. Just a mediocre average teenage boy, which was not actually the raw material of being, this holy warrior that his dad wanted. And this chapter asks the question, it asks readers to imagine what would this kid have been if he was not raised on this poison. And you feel sorry for him in a way, but not too sorry, because at a certain point also, he becomes a man. And one of the things I really appreciated about your book was you have this beautiful and horrifying love story between two child soldiers in the Lord's Resistance Army. And one of them, he's a 19-year-old boy who actually rapes the other girl who's kidnapped, and later she decides to marry him. And how was it to portray people who are so often they would just be seen in the media as one-dimensional demonic caricatures? How is it to portray them as real people?
Well, I'm going to partly answer that by reading from your book, because I really loved this section. Because I think part of that answer is just by trying to sort of truthfully as you can describe your subjects and let them tell their stories in their own words, and also, sort of giving them the texture and complexity that they're not often given. Here you wrote about a teenage boy who's, he's going to be a jihadist. He's the son of a jihadist. But yet he also was watching porn with and lusting after teenage girls, and seemed like a sweet kid. So I'm going to read from this section. To this day, I wonder what Abu Mujahid might have been in another world. He was too timid to be a bully. He didn't strut around like a Tunisian fighter, high on other people's fear. He wasn't some ball of social awkwardness from Antwerp, nor desperate for recognition like my nephew, who found in the Kalishnikov an intimate to wriggle him out from beneath the social imprisonment inflicted by his family's older men. He was simply the son of a father who happened to be an avid jihadist. He was small, calm, nice, innocent. Yes, innocent. It was the innocence that stuck into me like a barb. He was a sapling, one whose roots had been watered with blight. We met long after his infection, but the disease spread thoroughly, and one day it would surely consume him. He had no true beliefs, just directives to follow, given to him by the people he loved. He was told that he and his generation would be the redemption of the previous ones. His cohort was raised in the culture of jihad, fed the notion that they would restore a deformed religion and save the next generations of Muslims, who would grow up on tales of true Muslim conquest, not the infidel pap of Mickey Mouse. Knowing better than to voice his puzzlement, off he went to the front. His father was ISIS from back before ISIS. Abu Mujahid was born ISIS. He'd be ISIS until he died. So I just loved, and then the next sentence, but the boy was still a boy, and a boy he wanted to be. So again, just this nuances of portraying people who we often hear of as one-dimensional perpetrators, but then also realizing that war is complicated, and sometimes victims and perpetrators are the same people. And I thought that was done so beautifully in this book. And I think one thing also this book did is that it also complicated the idea of the narrative of war itself, of the idea of two sides, sort of good and evil. Even among the resistance, the Syrian resistance, we've heard that, it was the rebels fighting for freedom against the government. But even amid the rebels, there were lots of complexities and even some evil and good and evil existing side by side. How did you handle that?
Oh, God. So I think the first sort of false simplification that I saw put on the Syrian War was an adaptation of the War on Terror framework. So the War on Terror framework is the idea that there is like the secular good, initially George W. Bush Western, but then other states adopted it. There's the secular good, and then there's the evil men with beards, and the evil men with beards are so evil that whatever you do to these evil men with beards, it doesn't matter. You could like drone bomb them, you can do anything, that it's justified because you're secular and good. And America really advanced this narrative, but very quickly it got adopted by all sorts of other actors. You could see it, in Israel when they murder protesters in Gaza, but you could also see it with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So one of the first things that happened when the protests broke out, and these were protests that initially started because of police and security services murders of some young people. So when these protests broke out, this official state narrative was, these are terrorists. These are bearded Islamic terrorists who are evil and bad, and anything you do to a bearded Islamic terrorist is fine, because look at them. And that was something that was advanced throughout the war. Now, the other simplification, as you say, is the idea that there was like a monolithic group of rebels. In fact, many of the rebels were actually just neighborhood men trying to defend their block from people in the security services coming and like snatching people and torturing them to death. Some of them were also army defectors who didn't want to kill their fellow citizens. Some of them were also Al-Qaeda members that were trying to take advantage of what was going on. And as the war progressed, this started to be further complicated by external backers like Saudi Arabia and Qatar that would back one rebel faction and not another as a way to advance their problems with each other. Then by Turkey and the US and much later Israel. So you had this war that started mutating and shattering and fragmenting, and it was all done on top of civilians who might not necessarily ideologically subscribe to any of the groups, but might not be able to, for instance, live in a regime area because the son in the family hadn't done his army service and he'd be tortured and maybe killed for that. And it's very hard to describe this in the sort of short style that's favored sometimes by the media, where you want something that has an English language name, that has a quick tagline that you could call it like secular or Islamist or freedom or dictatorship. It doesn't really sum up sometimes the complexities and the extremely, extremely difficult choices that people have. And one of the reasons that I think the war on terror narrative has been so dangerous is that when you make a group an ultimate evil, it justifies war crimes against the people who live under that group. For instance, when the Syrian government gasses a rebel-held area, the argument is, well, it's Al-Qaeda. When America bombed Raqqa, Marwan city, and destroyed 90% of the city, the argument is, well, it's ISIS, right? So, what do you want to do? Do you like ISIS? When horrific war crimes were perpetuated by militias that were backed by US air power in Iraq, and these war crimes were even posted on social media, well, it was against ISIS, and what do you expect to happen? And I thought your book, it did such a good example of exploring that dynamic with another group that, like ISIS, is seen, for good reasons, as the ultimate evil group, which is Boko Haram. You talk with such nuance and sensitivity about the way that vigilante groups formed by parents, right, trying to save their daughters, that these very, well-warranted groups started morphing into militias that began committing war crimes of their own, especially in collusion of the army. And how is it for you, so I've always found that when I try to introduce nuance to this, and when Western journalists try to introduce nuance to stuff like the war on terror, the war against ISIS, the war against Al-Qaeda, people will accuse you of being like a sympathizer. How was it for you to talk about the problems and the war crimes being committed by anti-Boko Haram forces?
Yeah, that's a good question because, you had a lot of good points. Because this kind of war on terror rhetoric has been now adopted by so many repressive states, right? Nigeria, Somalia, these places now have their wars on terror where backed by the US, where they can now justify, a litany of abuses against their civilians in the names of hunting out the Islamists. And so in that case, the civilians are not left with any options. On one side, they're menaced by the terrorists. On the other side, they're menaced by their military and their government. And so people do get fed up. And I wrote about vigilantes who took up arms to fight Boko Haram themselves in Nigeria, and kind of, what happens when people become the law and order. They start to veer over the edge, and they become guilty of their own abuses. And so... yeah, I think, that is something, I think especially some Nigerians have asked me, are you sympathizing with terrorist groups by sort of talking about not only the atrocities of the terrorists, but of people fighting the terrorists? But I think it's just necessary, because this is what ordinary people are living under. Now, people who once welcomed the vigilantes fighting Boko Haram are now afraid of those same vigilantes because they don't know what to predict. They don't know who to feel safe from or feel unsafe from. And so I really empathize with, Marwan talking about seeing his friends join different militant groups, but also just feeling like he didn't want to get involved because he didn't really trust any of the sides.
Exactly. Marwan was, so one of the sort of early debates in the Syrian revolution was whether it should be armed or not.
Yeah.
And many people never wanted it to be armed for a variety of reasons. One is that once something gets armed, it fundamentally changes it, and very often introduces the need to get money, right, for more weapons, which introduces the need to backers. Another reason is people felt that they couldn't win, and if they kept up a civil resistance, that might be something that worked. There are a whole lot of reasons that people did not want the revolution to be armed. But there are also many reasons that people did want the revolution to be armed. And one of the fundamental choices in this book that the characters have to face is whether they want to pick up a gun. And Marwan is always someone who is like, no, I do not want to do this. I don't believe in killing people. I don't believe in joining military groups. It's brainless. It turns you into a sadist. No. But his two best friends, two young men named Niall and Tarek, who he grew up with, did join groups. And both of these guys were young, artistic guys. Niall was an art student. Tarek, Niall's brother, was a literature student who wrote poetry. But because of what they had seen in the war, they believed that there was no peaceful negotiation. In fact, going to protests without being armed was just basically volunteering to be slaughtered. And so they took up arms, and Niall died quite early in the war, fighting against the government. And his brother Tarek, he died much later in the war, but only after joining an Islamist group and gradually adopting their ideology and fundamentally changing as a person.
One thing which I love about this book, which is again showing the complexity of life in this extreme situation, are some of the up-close details which sometimes verge on the absurd, but are incredibly entertaining to read. For example, for a while, Marwan is running this internet cafe that's frequented by members of ISIS, and he gets, really close to these members, and sort of witnesses their interactions and presents presents their humanity too, in a sense, the humanity of these guys who found themselves in this situation and are now on one side, and also the humanity of people who are being forced to deal with them now and to make business with them and live side by side with them. But there's also another point in the book that you guys write where you say you wonder which depiction of history is more accurate, that from being up close or sort of looking at it from a distance. And I wonder if you could talk more about that. And did that also play into your process? Because obviously Marwan witnessed this, but during the process, when you guys were co-writing the book, involved you interviewing him about his memories and having that sort of distance as you wrote the book?
Oh God, yeah, that sort of double vision. I mean, writing a book together, especially writing a memoir together that's written in first person, it's an incredibly sort of complicated act that involves a great amount of stepping forward and backward and changing perspectives, and also sort of suppressing your own ego. I just want to give a note a little bit about how this book was written. When I met Marwan online in 2013, he was living in Raqqa. And initially I knew him as a source through Twitter. He would tell me really horrifying and interesting details about life under ISIS. I remember one story he told me it was during World Cup, and obviously, every Syrian wants to watch World Cup, right? And ISIS had confiscated all of the TVs from the cafes because they thought that the knees of the soccer players were just too sexy, and this, was just too much. But then they were watching the World Cup themselves on their phones because, dudes like football. And so he would tell me stories about these, and we started to become friends. As I learned Arabic especially, he really played a huge role in my literary education in Arabic. And then one day I asked him, I was like, dude, do you have any, photos on your phone, just of daily life photos like we all have, right? And he didn't, but then he offered to take photos. And I was like, dude, that's dangerous. Don't you take any risks? And he's like, oh, no, I won't. And then, of course, he goes and does incredibly risky things, like taking photos in an ISIS hospital or taking photos of bread lines, literally hiding his phone behind his falafel sandwich on the streets, because he's a crazy baller journalist. And we did collaborations where he would take these photos, I would draw from them, he would write more and more, until we had done 3 of them for Vanity Fair and decided that we wanted to do something way bigger, and we decided to do this book. And to do this book, in part, he left Syria and he smuggled himself into Turkey. And I went to Istanbul a dozen times, and half of it was written, from notes that Marwan took, notes that he would take on his phone and email to himself, because he couldn't have paper notes, because if you have paper notes and ISIS raids your house, then they think you're a spy and kill you. So he took these notes on his phone and he'd email them to himself. And he at that time had imagined that he would write the book when he was an old man. But then we used these notes to make the backbone of what became Brothers of the Gun. And then the other half, I just sat down next to him and I interviewed him. And I would interview him about every single detail of a scene, like how high the wall was, what the person was wearing, what he was thinking. And I wrote half, he wrote half. Then we both totally rewrote each other's halves. He told me that I structure like a basic Becky that doesn't know anything about literature, and was like, I'm not slogging through this from birth to current like a fucking journalistic thing. I studied Beckett and James Joyce in school, and I didn't do it for this. And I was like, Marwan, when you say the events of 1982 as if it has emotional resonance, no American can understand that, Marwan. No one knows you're talking about Hafez al-Assad bombing Hama and killing tens of thousands of people. And so we kind of went back and forth. And also we challenged a lot of each other's suppositions. He challenged me a lot for assumptions I might have had about, people who were perhaps super religious. I challenged him a lot to write more about women and to write more about people he might not have known, for instance, like activists. And we rewrote and we rewrote and we rewrote each other. And then our brilliant editor, Chris Jackson, who's the smartest man in publishing, he very sensitively edited the whole thing, asked us for lots more fill-ins. And at the end of that, we had something where we're each in both of us are in each sentence. Right. And I think when we were rewriting, we had this constant alternation, because this is Marwan's life. This is Marwan's hometown. These are people he knew intimately. Some people he had known, since he was 4 or 5. Whereas while I've covered the Syrian War since 2013, I've only been in Syria once for a day. And it's not my country, and these are not my friends, and this is not something that I have lived with the way Marwan did. And I think that while I think that the local intimate perspective is the best perspective, I think that there's a great deal of value in having the distance too, because I think that a lot of times when you're very up close to something, it becomes normal. That's human nature. And that the outsider perspective can make you question, make you say, what's beyond that assumption of normality? What is this really?
Yeah, I agree. But that reminds me, there are a lot of words, Arabic words, a lot of dates, references used in the narrative that aren't explained, that we aren't given a tidy little glossary, which I like. I like that there's not sort of an over-explanation or pandering to the Western reader. Can you explain why you guys decided to do it like that?
Because Marwan hates spoon-feeding people, which is
Right.
the exact word he would use. He's like, I am not going to write a book that starts with Syria is a country in the Middle East, which is predominantly Muslim, but there are some Christians, Alawite, and Druze people and other religions. He's like, no, man, I want to write literature. And so we kind of constantly negotiated and to see what's too much, what do we have to explain, what can we trust people are capable of Googling. Yeah. And it's something really hard because people in America don't know anything about the Middle East, and they don't know anything about Africa either. They don't know anything about almost anywhere in the world. And I think that it's something that when you're writing about a country that's not America for an American audience, there's this constant frustrating balancing act that you have to do. Like, how much do I have to spell out, and how much do I not want to mess up my narrative by spelling out really basic things? And as a model, this might sound strange, but maybe not, we looked a lot at The Handmaid's Tale. Because The Handmaid's Tale, Gilead is not a world that Americans know. It's a world that Margaret Atwood invented. And yet Margaret Atwood never literally spells out, handmaids are women that wear red dresses that are fertile, and aunts wear khaki dresses and they have tasers and they control the handmaids. She shows, right? She doesn't tell. And we tried to use more novelistic techniques like that. And so one of the things I really appreciated about your book is it's a much more like straightforward journalistic account than my book, but it also does a really good job of not pandering, but explaining. And it also explains things that are not the things that typically get explained in narratives about Africa. For instance, you speak about like the socialist government in Somalia. And you speak about all of these different sort of very, very interesting political movements. And you speak about it in a way that is not like sort of the typical way that it gets written about by the Nick Kristofs of the world, which is like, oh my God, look at the bad thing. Here's a contextless bad thing. Oh my God, sad. Can you talk about what it's like to write for Western readers who don't know anything about your subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I try to sort of go along the roads of like what I like to read. And when I'm reading books that get sort of too lost, or not too lost, but get too sort of dense and heavy with the history and the, I sort of lose attention. And so I wanted to, not disrupt my narrative as you were saying, but to give context, because especially with Africa, where so many people treat it like it's one country, I wanted to make the differences clear. I'm talking about this place, and this is very distinct from this other place I was talking about, even though these stories do have similarities. And so I still didn't include like a whole lot of sort of history in each of the stories, but I wanted to include the parts that felt relevant or that felt interesting and maybe felt surprising sometimes, and go from there. And I think that maybe academics would think, oh, there should be more of this, but I thought for the purposes of a book where it really is about the people, that that there is just enough that you should have. But still, I felt like more freedom doing the book than doing a lot of the articles I've done, where I feel like I have to translate so much more, being pushed by my editors to translate more than I would like. I want to assume that at least readers will get certain facts or certain dates, but often when working for publications, your editors want you to sort of translate and explain every detail. But with the book, I just felt like if you don't get it, then it's not my problem.
One of the parts that I really appreciated in your book, and that I think will ring true for anyone who's ever covered war, is you have this gorgeous, gorgeous evocation of Lagos and what it was like when you were living in Lagos, and especially the moment when there is filled with journalists that were covering Boko Haram, but then they were going back to Lagos and going to art openings and hanging out at nightclubs and going to hip hop concerts and having this life that was so electric and beautiful. And for me, it resonated a lot with a certain moment in Istanbul. It was around 2013, 2014, when the border was still open. And there was an economy of war journalists and fixers and aid workers and also spies. And people who very often were refugees, but they were also finding themselves for the first time away from familial control, and they were making good money, taking people into Syria. And it was, for many people you wouldn't think, like some Syrian refugees I know, for instance, it was the best time of their lives. And it's very hard to talk about that, how any place could be the best time of someone's life when it's essentially built on the hell that's happening, that's happening just to the south. And I just want to read, because it was so beautiful, this evocation of Lagos and also of the Somali Americans that were moving back to Somalia. Lagos was the love of our lives and the bane of our existences. We danced at a rotating set of nightclubs, gathered at an art exhibit openings and literary readings, saw each other at the same birthdays, weddings, and christenings, and went to the surprisingly nice beaches not far outside the city. We overpaid for the same imported food and drinks, overpaid for the same generators because there was little electricity, and overpaid for the same apartments and houses because of those electricity problems. But Lagos's energy was addictive. Despite how much it could frustrate you, its hustle and creativity were stimulating. People did not like to beg. You would complain often there. You would also accomplish some of your finest work. Public services were lacking in Lagos, so its inhabitants came up with innovative ways to survive. Even in prosperous gated communities, residents bought generators for electricity, dug boreholes for water, and hired guards for security. Yinka Marinho, who used to head the Lagos government's waterways agency, once told me, "We have the most expensive slums in the world. We're paying a lot for nothing, no running water, no power." I didn't mind much. When I was with friends late at night, driving and blasting music on 3rd Mainland Bridge, the path over Lagos Lagoon, that was the second longest bridge in Africa. As we headed to a club or house party, everything was right with the world. I was doing what I was supposed to be doing with the people I was supposed to be doing it with in the best city in the world. It was how I knew what young Somalis, freshly returned from abroad, must be feeling as they smoked up on the beach, drank illegal alcohol, and tried to create their country all over again.
Yeah, I mean, you described it so well. Just the many sides to a place, even when it's going through some of its darkest times. I was living in Lagos at a time when we were covering the Boko Haram crisis, and there was such a jarring difference from being in the Northeast and covering terrorist attacks, but then also being back in the capital and having those experiences at the same time, which I imagine it was like being in Istanbul covering Syria. And that's what's so special about this book, is having all the sides of those experiences being shown so well. And I think that it could really only be shown by someone who was in it, who was living in it. And as you were saying, it really is, I think, one of the only sort of narratives by a working class Syrian from the time.
Exactly. Like most books about, and this isn't just a reflection on Syria, it's also, a reflection on the publishing industry too, and how few working class narratives from anywhere are able to get into the publishing industry. Another reason, like my editor, Chris Jackson, rocks so much. Yeah, this is, as far as I know, the only working class book like from the Syrian War by like a Syrian where it's not ghost written. It's not like a Westerner writing in someone else's voice, like being like, I love Angela Merkel. It's not that. It's Marwan, and it's Marwan's thoughts and his philosophy. And even though we co-wrote it together, the thoughts and the take on life is his. And I think it's so important to have those voices. I mean, I think that the great literature of wars has always been written by the people who participated in them or by the people who suffered through them. And I think it's the same with Syria, just as it would be the same with the Spanish Civil War, just as it would be the same, with World War I or the Holocaust.
Absolutely. And, I also wanted to touch upon, so basically, I mean, there were, again, just so many details in this book that sort of surprised and complicated the traditional narrative of what we have of what's war like and what especially war was like in Syria. And one of those passages was when you guys read about Mosul, which was gained its name as being one of the first major cities to be taken over by ISIS. And yet what Marwan finds there is not what he expected or what readers would expect. And I think I'll read some of that. I'm gonna start. Mosul gave me a stunning first impression. From the moment I began wandering its streets, it struck me as different from the other towns we'd been through that ISIS controlled. The city had been taken in a few hours with no serious battles, simply because the Iraqi army had run. There was neither the destruction of Sinjar nor the lifelessness of Raqqa. Perhaps because ISIS had been born in Iraq and thus had more popular support, they treated this Iraqi city more leniently. War hadn't yet eaten Mosul. The markets were crowded with people. The hospitals were functioning with sufficient medicine. The cafes were filled with smokers, and the arcades with teenagers playing video games. Students attended university exams. TVs blared Abadi's pompous promises to retake the city. But these were merely trompe l'oeil. Aside from shortages of power and water, even though the tortuous Tigris cracks its way through the city and other basic services, the city was severed from its Iraqi roots and forced to open its west, where the Islamic State dominated, at least for now.
I think that, and also I do want to note that when this leniency that ISIS initially displayed to Mosul was not at all evident once the battle started for taking Mosul, when the ISIS did the most hideous possible things to the city, including welding people into their homes and blowing up an extremely famous and historic mosque there. But it's true that ISIS would not have been able to dominate a city of 2 million people with 800 fighters without at least some people in that city being complicit with it. And there, you could say there's a variety of reasons for this complicity, perhaps one of them being atrocities done by central government. Another reason being the sort of, honestly, like a Sunni supremacist fascism. And another reason just being like, well, we've been conquered so many times and I don't want to risk my life and get beheaded. But yeah, no, there was definitely some complicity amongst civilians in Mosul to Raqqa, and it also was treated much more leniently at first than perhaps some complicity to civilians in Mosul to ISIS, not to Raqqa, oh my God. And it certainly was treated much more leniently at first than Raqqa was. And he mentioned Sinjar. I mean, Sinjar was the site of the Yazidi genocide, where Yazidi men and elderly women were mass murdered, and Yazidi women were enslaved, and Yazidi children were enslaved and forcibly converted. So there's no comparison to that. But again, this is something that it's not really found in a lot of stories, and in part because it's not something anyone wants to say, right? It's someone once wrote about how in France, I think like 7% of the population, maybe less, maybe like 3% participated in the resistance. But after the war, everyone was in the resistance, right? Everyone was a hero, all heroes. And I think that's the sort of narrative that often happens when you have a group like ISIS taking over a city, that at the time people just want to live and they just want to survive. But afterwards, you have to pretend it was different.
Exactly, yeah.
I think we're going to do questions.
Okay.
If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic. Or we can let you guys keep talking as well.
Are there any questions? My God, look at their judgmental eyes.
I have a question. It's interesting that you brought up that your co-author Marwan brought up 1982 and that your response was, but American audiences don't care. And it's striking that narratives of any events, for example, in parts of the Middle East, it's always about the past. Like when it's and speaking with some very tangential personal experience of this, like any narrative about what's happening today is always about the past. It's always 1982. It's always the Sykes-Picot line. It's always something that comes. The past is everything. The past shapes everything. The context is everything. And in a lot of Western or sort of Anglo-Saxon narratives, it's very context-free. It's even when we talk about ISIS in Iraq today, you're hard-pressed to find articles that mention the invasion of 2003, that mention the first Gulf War, and so on. And how do you? And it's a very deliberate and manufactured collective amnesia. But how do you handle that collective amnesia when telling stories from a part of the world where the history is everything?
This is a very, very important point. Sometimes I feel like America's relation to its innocence is of a woman that gets repeated hymen reconstruction surgery and pretends that she's a virgin each and every year. I think that one of the things that we tried to do in this book was we tried to speak, for instance, about the invasion of Iraq. I mean, Marwan's teachers went to fight America in Iraq, and he speaks a lot about the intense fear, right, of having this army invade the neighboring country, and the fear that it would spill over the border, the fear that they were going to kill him, And I think that you're absolutely right, that there's this extreme context, and often even worse and even less innocently. It's not like Hama 1982. It's like a weird Orientalist narrative about ancient tribal hatreds and this battle between Sunni and Shia or whatever. Whereas when it comes to Western actions, we whitewash them. And also when the West talks about itself too, it doesn't use this sort of context. The West, America, is loath to talk about the way that Trump comes out of histories of white supremacy, right? About how he echoes earlier narratives and how he echoes structural things. And that's because the West when it writes about itself, it grants Westerners free will. And when it writes about other parts of the world, it makes them entirely slaves of their context, right? So when America writes about Americans, they imagine, the world was born when I was born, I made all my choices myself, I came from no structures, and also we didn't do nothing bad. And when they write, for instance, about Syria, they'll bring up things that happened in the deep, deep, deep past to kind of create some unchanging Orientalist nature and draw from that. However, Marwan as a person is someone who is deeply immersed in history himself for his own reason. He was someone who, when he was stuck in this religious school that he really disliked, he would escape into books about Abbasid and Umayyad history. That was just like that's his passion and his hobby. And so I think that he writes about history in this book from a very different perspective, which is the perspective of something that he loved and something that he studied and something he was inspired by deeply as well.
Hi. So I want to kind of go back to this idea of like portraying normalcy under conditions where people don't expect normalcy. I was having a conversation with a professor of mine who is an Iraqi author who talks a lot about, or talks kind of critically about things like photo series that show people in North Korea like doing normal things and people being amazed by that, like, oh look, North Koreans take picnics and eat ice cream, and how that kind of participates in a sort of exoticization of these people, even while trying to perpetuate a narrative that they're normal and like meet normal Western standards of like what daily life should look like. So how do you kind of navigate portraying daily life without participating in that exoticization of being like, oh look, like people are just like us, but somehow that statement is a distancing tool in its own kind of right?
Yeah, because just like us means like, look at them, they're humans like we are. We didn't know they were humans, but look, they're eating ice cream just like humans. Yeah, it's really fucked up. I mean, well, for me, I mean, it's because I wrote the book with Marwan, and he just, he was writing about his own life, and so whatever it is, it's his, and yeah, it's just his. But in terms of my other work, I don't know. I mean, I tend not to write stuff that I tend, I guess, in my work actually to focus on smart rebels. I've always sort of focused on that. So that smart rebel might be like a dude who's working construction in Abu Dhabi, and then he's tipping off like The Guardian and the New York Times in his spare time while pretending to his boss he's playing Candy Crush. That rebel might be a woman who's a sex worker from the Bronx who is falsely arrested and takes on the police and refuses to plea out like everyone else. And when I read about those things, I suppose the thing that I'm trying to make not normal is, or that where I'm worrying about normalizing, it's not about the person, it's about the structure. Like, I don't want to normalize, for instance, these fucked up court systems, right? I don't want to normalize labor laws in Abu Dhabi that make it so that they take people's passports. I don't want to normalize the behavior of the police towards sex workers, which sometimes involves rape and often involves extortion. I don't want to normalize that. And I think that when you make questions about normalizing and not, very often it makes more sense to turn your eye to power and to turn your eye to structure rather than being like, oh my God, this person, they're North Korean, but they stand on two legs just like we do, which is like, I think where, and is your Professor Sinan on tune, by the way? Damn, he is the best. I love his novels so much, and he hosted actually the launch of this book. Yeah, Sinan is quite right and always astute.
Other questions?
Hi. So I'm currently working on a long story which is set in a country in West Africa, and it's going through a long editing process of going from being extremely long to only very long. And one of the things I've noticed in that process is how almost subconsciously context and nuance for characters who are not American in the story seem to just slip away. And I suppose what I'm wondering is, have you had those battles, both of you? And from your writing, it seems like often you've won them, and if so, how have you won those battles?
I'm having flashbacks. Yeah, I think, I have had those battles. I mean, less with the book because you do have a lot more freedom and a lot more space. But I think that with stories, I think for me, my technique in writing from abroad has often been to sort of do more profiles, sort of in order to sort of illuminate issues I'm interested in. And by virtue of them often being profiles, that gives it more sort of creative room to keep in some of those nuances. But you know, it's a case-by-case basis. I mean, sometimes I'm more successful than others. Usually when it is for a long-form article, I have more success. But I don't know if I have any sort of winning strategies beyond just sort of being stubborn and constantly fighting my editor on every single point, and usually winning most of the time, some of the time.
Yeah, being stubborn. I mean, trying to see what else you can cut. But yeah, oh my God, I've like lost so much context sometimes. I remember I had a piece on refugees in Greece, and one of the points I wanted to make was that like literally every single person was making money off of these refugees, including myself, right, as a journalist. But there's a whole economy. The government is making money off of them. The police are making money off of them. The people that build the camps are making money off of them. The aid workers are making money off of them. The volunteers are making Tinder pictures off of them. You know, everyone is profiting off of them except them, right? And that actually what these people want in this camp, they don't want someone to play with their kids. They don't want someone to give them a tent, essentially, though it's, you know, nice in the short term. What they want is a trustworthy smuggler. That is the single thing that they want. They want a smuggler that's going to efficiently get them to Germany and not steal their money and endanger their lives. And yeah, that was something that got cut, and I was very sort of sad about that. But, you know, sometimes, you know, it's always a negotiation, and sometimes also I've had points that I thought were so brilliant that perhaps weren't. But yeah, always fighting.
We can do one more question, if anyone has any. Great, thank you both so much. This has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.